All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Diaz. Today's webinar is Developing Measurable Program Objectives. For those of you that are not familiar with who I am, I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Agricultural Education and Communications. I'm located in the Tampa Bay area at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center. Today's webinar is really going to be focusing in on developing some solid objectives to your program so that we can put it in your ROA and section 23 of your packet. So a brief outline of what we'll be going over today is yesterday we went over the situational statement and needs assessment process, so we'll discuss moving from that situation to your objectives. Just some real basic consideration for objective development, and then getting into what those objectives look like. So the main objective levels that you want to create within your packet, Bloom's taxonomies for educational objectives, and then some of the guidelines for writing objectives like using the SMART framework. So I like to start off with this because we all know we have a logic model that we need to develop for our programs. Our section 23 and our ROA is essentially a logic model. Starts with the situation, and for today's webinar we're going to be focusing on the results section that you see there. Developing what our vision for success is, and measuring the results of our program in tune with the objectives that we create. So yesterday we know within the situational statement webinar we outlined what the problem and issue was, why it was a problem, so on and so forth. And we want to use the information that we glean from that process to create program objectives, because really program objectives are the change that we look to create with our program and how we move from situation A, which is the problem or issue, to situation B, which is an ideal state, and which is really the impact of our programs. Some real basic considerations for your situational statement. Oh, here's my thing. I'd like to stay on one spot. The objectives should really emphasize usefulness for your program. So, I think a lot of times people over-focus on the accountability piece, and that's important, but you also have to make sure that your program objectives help to collect data so that you can continue to improve your program. So when developing your objectives, just take that into consideration. And then, within your objectives, state the results or benefits in terms of what will happen within the learner or the participants of the program. So, don't state, I'm going to educate folks on X. You want to put your objectives in what you expect to see within the learners that engage in your program. So they're really at a very basic level within your packet, you should have at least one objective in each of the objective outcome levels. So there's the immediate outcomes that are more of the educational objectives, looking at changes in knowledge, attitudes, skills, and aspirations. A lot of times you'll hear the acronym called CASA, which is essentially that in an acronym. These are outcomes that you expect to see directly after your educational program. Then you want to create an objective for intermediate outcomes. These are really action-based objectives. So they learned something, now what are they doing? And it's relationships to changes in behavior or practice adoption. And then the long-term outcomes, which are essentially the impacts. You're changing social, political, economic, environmental conditions as a result of your program. So, some of those will look like healthier participants, improved water quality, conservation of water. So those are some just basic examples, but that kind of relates to what some of the conditions that some of the programs would look to create. So we will go ahead and start off with immediate outcomes. And when thinking about developing your objectives, there's really two ways you can report immediate outcomes objectives or develop immediate outcome objectives. There is kind of the self-reported objective. So, you'll have, within your objectives, you'll state that participants will report increased knowledge in a certain area, or there'll be more the assessment-based objectives where you actually look to see their ability to apply knowledge in certain situations. So as we go through these different slides, I'll try to explain and integrate how those look a little bit differently based on how you develop your program. So within the domains of learning, I kind of mentioned this already. There's the CASA suite. So there's the the cognitive domain that really looks at acquisition of facts and knowledge. So it's essentially increasing knowledge. The psychomotor domain. So that is actually skill acquisition. So they may understand the concept, but The psychomotor domain actually looks at their ability to develop skills to carry out their acquisition of knowledge. And then the affective domain, which is really an overlooked domain, and it looks at attitudes and aspirations, especially in context of water quality, water conservation, some of the more controversial areas. You want to make sure you're able to change knowledges and aspirations to make sure that they're actually adopting behaviors. So aspirations typically looks at the intention of the adopting practices or changing behaviors depending on the context of your program. Bloom's taxonomy is a framework that a lot of folks use within the cognitive domain. Bloom's taxonomy is more appropriate for instructional objectives, so looking at small p objectives, so for different activities. If you're trying to figure out how you want to evaluate that program, it's really useful to use this framework to see, okay, what is it that I expect my audience to be able to do? And depending on the intensity of the program, you can target different rungs within the taxonomy. So for example, if it's a 1 hour or 1 day workshop, you want to kind of focus on the application to the knowledge, because it's just more reasonable to expect someone to do something on that lower level where they're maybe recalling knowledge or able to discuss a certain concept, rather than in a series-based program where they're actually able to evaluate options, evaluate scenarios, because they've been engaged in your program for a longer period of time. And thinking about developing the objectives specifically, you don't want, for your large P programs, you do not want to include any of these verbs. You want to look at more of the larger scale takeaways. So you'll hear a lot from your DEDs or your chairs that you want an objective that you can keep as you adapt your program. So if you're doing an actual assessment, you would do something in the regards of a certain percentage of your program participants will demonstrate increased knowledge, and then you can provide a description of what that looks like within this context. If you're doing more self-reported metrics, that would be where you'd look at an objective where it's, for example, at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of agricultural best management practices, yada, yada, yada. So you see how they're specific in regards to what they're looking to create, but they're also abstract so that you don't have to create 100 different objectives based on each activity and as your program changes. So it kind of gives you that balance of being specific and broad at the same time. Since we have a small group, I want to pause real quick for questions before we move on. If anyone has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or put in your chat, just in regards to what we've talked on to this point.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I don't know if anybody else is having a hard time hearing the presentation, but it keeps on.
Okay, so I think I heard in it, and while you were talking, the audio cut out. So I'm going to take everyone's video off because I think that might be messing with the bandwidth. So if you guys can turn off your video, that might help with some of the audio issues.
Hmm.
All right, can you guys hear me better now? If you can just put in the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, but I wasn't having any issues before.
Okay. Whoever was having issues before, are you good? So far, so good. All right, thanks, Sarah. All right, so since we don't have any questions, I'll keep plugging along, and if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat or interrupt. So within these instructional objectives, there's 3 components that you'd want to include if you're actually doing a true assessment. So this is not a self-reported assessment, but this will be objectives in relationship to actual performance. So you want to have the performance component, so outlining what is it you expect the learner to be able to do. Condition, so this is an objective. You want to describe what it is that the context in which they're trying to do. So for example, if you want someone to create a depreciation schedule using a computer, for example, you'd want to make sure that you have that included in your objective. And then what successful performance looks like. So that's a criterion. If there's a specific threshold for success, you want to include that within your objective. Again, these are all instructional objectives, so this would be to help to inform the design and evaluation of the program, but when it comes to reporting, you want your program objective to be more abstract so that it doesn't have to be changed every time you do a program. So some real quick examples of performance. The learner will be able to calibrate a pesticide sprayer. The learner will demonstrate how to properly prepare vegetables for freezing. Their learning will be able to prepare a financial statement from their farm records. And then the learner will be able to identify common garden insects and list control measures for each. So that just gives you an idea of, explicitly outlining what the performance is. And this helps to not only plan your program, but helps to just, with the design of the evaluation instruments, because you're really explicit on what you're looking for. One of the things that you want to make sure that you consider as well is the performance of observable. So here's a real quick example of understanding how you can take, not necessarily an observable action and turn into an observable action that you can then evaluate. So the learner will be able to prepare a depreciation schedule. So the question is, how will you know the learner is able to prepare the schedule? You need to include an observable action as part of your objective. So then you do, using sample data, the learner will prepare and submit a depreciation schedule. So you can actually observe and critique the depreciation schedule because the learner has submitted, and that's something that you can then observe. So this slide just kind of, expands that concept a little bit more. So, operate a computer record keeping program. So that's something observed. You can look at someone doing that. Discriminate between normal and diseased plant samples. That's covert. You have to add an indicator so you can actually see it. So, for example, sort into two piles, one with normal plant samples and one with disease. You can actually observe that and evaluate their performance at that point. Recall the procedure for printing a financial statement from their program records. Again, this is a covert action. You have to add an indicator to be able to see it. So, by bringing a copy of the financial statement to the next class, you can see that they did it and then evaluate their performance. And then circle each problem area in a financial statement. That's obviously overt. So this gives you an idea of, taking something that is maybe not something that you can observe and making an observable action for evaluation. So that's all I've got for the immediate outcomes. We'll be moving into the intermediate behavior change practice adoption objectives. Before I move into that, does anybody have any questions? Well, all right, so we'll keep plugging along. So this next level of objectives really needs to be connected to your previous knowledge, attitudes, and skills and aspiration level objectives. So, if they've learned something and as a result of learning something, you want to see some sort of action. And so you want to focus these next level of objectives in regards to participant behaviors and adoption of best practices. So some of the behavior change and best practices that you'll see in different program areas is increase fruit and vegetable consumption, increase enrollment in volunteer opportunities, increase implementation of micro irrigation. So, the horticultural agents will see a lot of that. Reduction in fertilizer and pesticide use, and creation of business plans. So this is, again, the next step. They're learning something, and then you want to see, what they're doing as a result of learning. And I usually tell folks, for your objectives, you want to look at the adoption of these best practices from a broad level. So kind of carrying over what I mentioned in the previous objectives, you want it to be overarching. So as your different activities adapt or change, or you add new programs, you can continue to report over those objectives, but they're specific enough so that you can understand what you're looking for. So, for example, I'm going to use the ag context again, at least, I'm going to throw out some random numbers just for example, at least 45% of program participants will adopt at least one agricultural best management practice within 1 year of program engagement as measured by follow-up survey. So you can see, it outlines, what the audience is expected to do and what time period, and that'll make a little bit more sense when we get into the SMART objective framework. That was just one real quick slide on practice adoption because I think it's really intuitive. I think as you develop your program, you identify what that kind of hit list of practices and behaviors are that you want to create. But that was just a real quick summary of what that looks like within the different outcome levels. I'll pause real quick if anyone has any questions. All right. So we don't have any questions, so I'll keep plugging along. So the last set of outcome levels is the long-term outcomes, also known as program impact. You'll a lot of times hear SEE condition, which is the social, environmental, and economic conditions that your program looks to create. And this is essentially the overall impact or goal of your program. So some of the examples, and I gave these a little bit earlier, is improved water quality as an indicator, conservation of water, improved health, increased agricultural production, youth active in the community, and then increased economic returns depending on what your program area is. So within all of these different outcome levels, you want to make sure you're utilizing the SMART framework so that your objectives are specific in terms of the target audience and the expected outcomes. Your outcomes are measurable, they're achievable. So this is where you try to be aspirational in moving the needle forward, but you want to make sure you're also realistic based on your audience, the level of frequency and extent of your program, and then other barriers that you may understand to practice adoption and other things. It should be relevant given the specific problem. So this is where you triangulate with your situational statement to make sure that it's relevant to the program that you're creating. So for example, if you're a food systems agent, evaluating your ability to mitigate bed bugs doesn't really make sense. So just make sure that your objectives are in tune with your program area and the conditions that you look to create. And then it should specify the time that you expect to see the specific outcome take place. So, whether it's directly after the workshop, a year afterwards, or so on and so forth, just make a judgment on when you expect to see that and be explicit within your objective. So an example is at least 50% of soybean farmers who successfully completed this program will use recommended seed rates within this cropping season. So you're measurable because you can see, a certain percentage of the audience. The audience is the soybean farmer. You're expecting them to use recommended seed rates, and then you're expecting to see that change in the cropping season. The achievable component is the 50% as well. You have to make a judgment based on literature, your engagement and expertise of it. 50% is something that's achievable, and then work from there. When you're creating these objectives, sometimes all of your objectives won't necessarily make the last cut. So you want to make sure as you develop your objectives, you screen them in tune with what the situation is, what your program area of focus is, and then just your beliefs as an educator in the organizational mission of extension. So, not all the objectives make the cut. Just use this different criteria to ensure that you have the most useful and most appropriate objectives for your program. So I am done talking for today's lecture. I want to kind of put things on you all. So I want you all to, based on your program areas, develop an immediate, intermediate, and long-term objectives. I want a CASA objective, a behavior change practice adoption objective, and a long-term objective from your program. I want all the folks to do it, and I will call folks at random to share, so be ready. I'll give you all about 5 or 10 minutes. I'll check in at 5 minutes to see if everyone's in a good spot. If not, we'll extend it to 10 minutes. But I want you to take into consideration one objective for each, using your SMART objective framework, and balancing being broad enough to continue to report under the objective, but specific enough so that it makes sense for you and can inform program development and evaluation. And if you guys have questions as you're doing it, please feel free to unmute yourself, put in the chat. I'm here to help. So I will start the timer now. I'm gonna put it for 5 minutes and check back in with you at that point. We got about 1 minute left. Do you guys think you'll be ready to share within the minute? Okay. So I got a yes and a no. So I'll let the time go to 5 minutes. If everyone still needs a little more time, we'll give a few more minutes. All right. That was 5 minutes. I'll give just a couple more minutes. I can figure out how to work this. We got about 20 more seconds, so try to wrap up. All right. So before I call on folks, do we have any folks that want to volunteer to share their objectives? All right, Sarah, if you want to share, you can just unmute and put your video on and share with us.
All right. So at least 30% of participants attending a healthy cooking class will increase their knowledge and improve behaviors related to healthy eating, including increased consumption of fruits and vegetables and making healthier food selections when shopping at the grocery store.
Okay. So one piece of feedback for you on that one, I think you tried to stack two objectives together. So you've got a knowledge-based objective and you have a behavioral objective. So just make sure that you parse those out. It just makes it easier for reporting so that you can report all your knowledge-based stuff in one and your behavioral change stuff in another. So that's just something to think about. Just keep it as clean as possible to knowledge, behavior, and condition. All right, do I have anyone else that wants to share before I start calling on folks? All right, Johanna.
Let me see, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. I have one immediate objective. I put 75% of the participants will increase their financial management knowledge after a series of 3 sessions.
Okay, perfect. So when you said financial knowledge, Johanna?
Yeah, financial knowledge.
Okay. So one of the things
Should I be more specific, like if it's budgeting or goals or anything like that?
Yeah, so usually what I do is I have folks couch it as financial planning best practices, and then in parentheses examples, creating budgets, so on and so forth. And then when you report on your outcomes, you can still report at that generic level of financial planning best practices, but then you can provide some description on what that means and what percentage fell into each. So, if you had a certain level of knowledge game in budgeting and so on and so forth. So it allows you to keep it broad so you can keep reporting in those financial best practices, but it's not as explicit of, budgeting and stuff like that. Because today you may be doing a budgeting workshop, tomorrow maybe something else. So.
Yeah. So then I should use best financial management practices.
That's usually what I tell folks. Best practices are an easy way to encompass the different components that you're doing, and then you have the opportunity, putting in parentheses, for example, and the different components within it. But then when you're reporting your outcomes, you can provide a little bit more detail, and especially in your impact statements of what it is that you're doing. That
are more related to credit or spending or getting out of debt, decreasing their debt, or
yes, exactly.
So on and so on. Okay.
Yep. So make sure that you don't have to create 50 different objectives, but can still feed into there. And as your program adapts and changes, you can continue.
And changes according to the needs.
Right. Exactly.
Alrighty. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, Mario.
Hello, everyone. I'm a state faculty here in Gainesville, and my emphasis is on beef cattle reproduction. So my immediate goal would be increase the working knowledge of livestock agents about principles of reproductive physiology of beef cows in cow-calf operations applicable to reproductive management.
Okay, very cool. So I'm going to give you a little bit of feedback on that. So within your objective, you want to make sure you identify at what extent you expect to see that. So that's kind of the measurable piece. So you want to say at least a certain percentage or a certain number of participants where you expect to see that outcome create. And then you want to make sure you differentiate how you're seeing this. So is it something that they're reporting this increased knowledge? And just be explicit. So for example, at least, and I'm just going to say a number and whatever, but just to give you an example, at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of beef cattle reproduction. And then you'd say as measured by survey, and you want to make sure you dictate when you expect to see that. So it'd be directly following a program activity. So just make sure you put those other additional pieces around what you've got, and that'll help for you to better understand what it is that you're looking for and how you evaluate it, because self-reporting is very different than giving someone an assessment to see what that knowledge is. So does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yep. All right.
John, can I just make a comment here for a moment?
Sure.
So when doing program objectives, when you're saying to have, one objective of knowledge gain and one objective of behavior change, what we're hearing from our CEDs and DEDs is frequently to not have two separate ones, to have it together as one. So I guess I'm struggling with how would we approach our when we go up for our packet or whatever, and they're like, no, you need to combine this. How should we proceed?
So unfortunately, there's a lot of CEDs and even that are giving that type of information, and some DEDs as well. That's unfortunately, they're giving information based on what they understand needs to happen. Unfortunately, that's not in tune with best practice for program development and evaluation. So it's just one of these things that just having that conversation, that you've either, through this webinar, engagement with me, PDEC, etc., that's the paradigm, and then just forging that conversation, because, when you start to collapse behavior and knowledge together, when it comes to reporting, there's going to be a lot of information that you're trying to put under one objective. So then in the review process, the reviewer's trying to differentiate and understand what those impacts are. And then when you're looking at reporting over time, you're trying to put a lot of data under one objective. So just reporting knowledge gain, there's a lot that'll go into that depending on the functionality of your program. So that's why you want to separate those out.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Diaz?
Yes, sir.
I think one of the problems we run into is, so when we're looking at a big program focus area, so like my livestock pastures, I've got objectives for pasture, pesticides, and also a youth component under that umbrella. So if you start putting an objective for each of those kind of smaller focus areas, and then we're breaking it up by knowledge and behavior change, you've now probably got 6 objectives. And I think some of the administration, they don't want to see 6 full objectives. They just want to kind of compartment and put it down to just a few of them. I think a lot of times that's why they say kind of put the knowledge and behavior in the same objective.
So what my response usually to that is you're not creating any additional work by parsing them out. You're just being clearer in what the objective is looking for, and you're reducing a lot of the peripheral noise. So by parsing out your behavior change or practice adoption objective from your knowledge objective, it's not creating additional questions to ask in your evaluation. It's not changing the way that you're planning your program. It's just being more explicit and parsing out what that looks like. Because it's a whole different objective. Knowledge gain is a different objective than behavioral change. So you need to just parse those out.
I totally agree on that.
And I mean, it's an educational component for, I mean, these CEDs and DEDs are also learning. They're not experts in program development and evaluation. So they're just going based on the best information that they feel like they have. So there's an education process, not only with you all, but with those administrators, so they understand how to give better advice to the agents and state specialists. And I've talked to folks with a lot, and they have that same hesitation where they're getting that feedback. And I tell them, you know, if it comes down to it, you can funnel those folks to me. We can have a conversation. But again, it doesn't create any additional work. It just parses that out. So it's a lot easier to see, okay, this is your knowledge objective. This is the outcome data you created. And there's that one-on-one connection. Then you can move on to behavioral change. You know, while 6 objectives may seem like a lot, it's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really. So. All right, I had another person, GSATs, that wanted to share their objective.
Yes, this is Geraldine Sachs. Good morning.
Good morning.
So along with that, I think sometimes in our reports we want to be sure that we were responsible for that learning component. So maybe that's why we want to say learn and utilize or whatever. But I've changed mine to match your one, just the behavior. So let's shoot. 75% of youth attending a 3-day 4-H cooking camp will use proper measuring techniques, resulting in quality baking projects by the end of this camp.
Beautiful. So that is an amazing instructional objective. I think that's something that will help to show you what you're expecting from your group. I think in regards to the objective that you would see in your packet, it's going to look a little bit different and it'll be more broad because that objective is tied specifically to that cooking class activity. So you'll just want to try to identify kind of what that higher order knowledge gain or skill that you'd want to create within your audience and create the objective in that way. Does that make sense?
Yes. So could we brainstorm on that a couple minutes?
Sure. So what would you envision as the, so I know that there's the, you know, there's the life skills, the career readiness and stuff like that within 4-H.
Well, could we incorporate the youth who are taking part in a baking contest and base it on the blue ribbon or red ribbon or their evaluation of their product they make?
Oh yeah, I mean, you can definitely use the objective that you created is extremely useful when trying to figure out how to evaluate the program. It's just trying to create so this gets at kind of what we were just talking about where we don't want a bunch of objectives, and this helps to mitigate some of that. So you would keep that objective for your own purposes.
Yes, but not for
not for your
packet,
right? So you would do something like at least 75% of youth participants will demonstrate increased workforce readiness skills or life skills or whatever that overarching concept is within 4-H, and then as measured, you know, directly during the program activity as measured by direct observation.
Okay.
So you see you're still feeding into those larger orders, but you're using something that's more specific for your own needs.
All right. So another objective I wrote was 25% of youth who took part in the 4-H cooking camp and baking contest will use their skills to serve the community.
Okay.
So like almost service based.
Yep. So you would couch that as kind of a community engagement behavior practice.
Yes.
That would just be one. So your larger order would be, you know, that percentage are going to be more engaged in the community, and then as you report your outcomes. So I usually do an outcome table where I just have simply, you know, how many participants, how many realize that outcome, and then underneath you can provide more description based on what you're saying. So it gives them some of an understanding of what it looks like explicitly, but it's not so explicit the objectives where you need one for the cooking class and one for your STEM class and one for your, you know, so on and so forth.
So it kind of answers that. So what? So what they know how to cook. Now what are they going to do with it?
Exactly.
So that higher order. Got it.
That's how I try to balance those administrative concerns of having a million objectives is you want to still have those objectives in those levels, but balance being broad and specific all at the same time. All right. Do I have any other folks that want to share? Maybe one or two more folks?
I will say that I liked that last objective as I'm getting ready to do a cooking class this evening, and I like the idea of using the final product as an evaluation method.
Yes.
So thank you for that, because this is definitely the evaluation. I had an evaluation that was provided to me, however, it was not super great. And so I've been tweaking it to balance that knowledge gain as well as those behaviors that might be changed because of it. And I think that that final product, can also potentially encourage people to eat healthy because they're going to learn how to prepare a tasty and healthy meal. Yes, I realize I'm combining, but just describing it easier.
Yeah.
They're going to eat it and they're going to hopefully enjoy it, and hopefully that's going to encourage some of that behavior change after they leave my office.
Right. And I encourage direct observation as a evaluation technique. I always say the proof's in the pudding. There's no better way to see knowledge gain than its application in different activities. So if you have activities that you're doing in your program, it's a really useful tool, and then it takes away some of that survey onus from your audience. And especially working with youth where the data that you're collecting isn't the greatest, observation is a very useful tool. All right. We have one more that wants to share with us. Otherwise, I'm going to call somebody out. No. All right, Anne. Can you share an objective with us? Nope. Anne walked away from her computer. Judy, can you share an objective with us? Oh, you don't have a mic. Oops.
Yes. Okay. Annually, 50% of the 30 persons who attend a healthy cooking demonstration will increase their knowledge of healthy food preparation methods as indicated by responses on a reflective end-of-class survey.
Beautiful. Yep. So you want to think, so is cooking going to be something that you continue to do as far as your healthy living type program? Is it just?
Yes.
Okay. So that's one of the things in specificity and broadness. If it's something you're going to continue to do and it's something that you feel like you'll be able to report over time, then keep it. Otherwise, if there's that higher level concept, so like reporting healthy living behaviors, understanding healthy living behaviors, and that balances cooking, eating, physical activity, and stuff like that. But if you feel like cooking is really your home and you'll continue to do cooking-based programs, then that was a beautiful objective.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so unless anybody has questions or wants to share their objectives, that's all I've got for today. Just real quick housekeeping before we're done. I'm always available. My information can be found both on the GCREC and AEC website, my telephone number and email. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. There's also a workshop that's going to be held in Plant City, open to all districts on April 16th. It's a hands-on program development and evaluation workshop. And then there will be one specifically for the Northeast District in November, and then a second one for the Southwest District at the end of April. If you do have a group that wants to do a program development and evaluation workshop, you can also reach out to me. I'm just trying to formalize a group of around 10, and then I can come out to your county and help you all out. So before we end with questions, comments, anyone want to share? So Sarah, the Northeast District is in, I think, the first week of November. I can send you that information after the webinar. And it's an IST, so you can register for it and get credit and all that good jazz. It's going to be in Columbia County. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And I will follow up with the recording, the PDF of slides, and then the assessment. So please fill out the assessment and let me know, what you thought of today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We'll have to connect Luke offline about NFLAG.
Thank you. I'll try to email you a little later today.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you very much.